The 2025 Formula One season came down to the final race, and all three championship contenders finished on the podium. Lando Norris is your 2025 Formula One world champion by 2 points over Max Verstappen. How did Lando and McLaren hold off Max Verstappen to claim a championship, and is Abu Dhabi still worthy of hosting the season finale for Formula One? Formula E is back as well, and Jake Dennis's winless streak ended in a dramatic finish after a late red flag. We will recap the Sao Paulo E-Prix, which kicks off a new season of the FIA Formula E World Championship. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Grid Live Wrap-Up, the final one of 2025 and the first one of 2026 as Formula E is up and running. I am Ben Schneider, hosting today in place of Joe Samaniego. With me is Kobe Lambeth from Grid Tonight and Matthew Rowe from GridNetworkTV.com. Apologies for the lack of music in the intro. We're still getting used to our new StreamYard setup here, but we have a great show planned for you all today, and we are glad that you are with us. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you don't miss the Grid Network in 2026 every time we host a new stream or upload a new video. And if you like what you see this afternoon, you can consider joining our Patreon. Join Colin Deschelle, Mark, Robin, David, Matthew, and Crystal in investing in the Grid Network and helping keep us on the air throughout 2026 and beyond. If you're watching us live on YouTube, we now have the Super Chats and Super Thanks features enabled as well, or you can visit the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box below if you'd rather make a one-time donation to us instead. Well, gentlemen, it's good to see you again. I guess it was the shortest retirement from the Grid Network ever for me, but I'm happy to be filling in for Joe here today on the wrap-up show once again. We have to start, obviously, with Abu Dhabi and the Formula One World Championship season finale. Lando Norris is the 35th driver to win the F1 World Drivers' Championship. He finishes third, while Oscar Piastri was second, and Max Verstappen picked up the 8th win of his 2025 campaign. So by 2 points, Norris holds on. He is the world champion in a race that was rather tame, to be quite honest. We didn't see Verstappen make any attempts to do what Lewis Hamilton did to Nico Rosberg in 2016, and that was back up the McLaren drivers into Charles Leclerc or George Russell early. Pit strategy was also rather straightforward. Weather doesn't typically play a factor at Abu Dhabi. No safety car, no cars retiring from the race, really no incidents at all, aside from that one with Yuki and Lando. We'll get into that a little bit later. But Matthew, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on how Lando Norris and McLaren were able to bring home the championship and a solid 2-3 finish to end their season.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Also, welcome back. Short little retirement for you. Thanks for being able to host. Yeah, I mean, Kobe and I both got like 3 hours of sleep watching the snowflake at 4:30 Eastern time. 3 hours and 8 minutes of sleep according to my watch. So I woke up and saw that. Like you said, rather tame. First off, hats off to Lando Norris and McLaren. They didn't blow it. I think if there was one more race in the season, they would have, and I think Max would have been the world champion. But guess what? He's not. So congratulations, Lando Norris, and McLaren. And they did everything they needed to do at the end of the day. And Matt, as soon as lap 1, turn 1 happened, you almost knew Max was going to win. And you knew Oscar was going to be second and Lando was probably going to be third. I don't think Charles Leclerc or George Russell, even George Russell was having brake issues at the start of the race, but Charles really had nothing for Lando. I know they kept trying to hype it up, but he didn't seem like he did all during the start of this Grand Prix. But yeah, McLaren did everything what they needed to do. And I would argue they almost lost it themselves. And I think Max Verstappen would said, I mean, he was 110 points back, and that ended up being only 2 back or whatever it was. Max pretty much said it wasn't what he was doing, it was what the other people were messing up. And I would argue today that Red Bull made a mistake, and I know Max dominated, but they made that mistake not taking the only strategy card out of Max's hand, which would have been trying to back up Oscar and Lando into someone like Charles or George. And they didn't do it. They had a 23-second gap, and they decided to stay out. And obviously, Max put belt to butt at the end of the day, but they really should have expected. There were really no incidences, no safety cars. And another thing Red Bull did wrong, I think, which cost them, was Yuki did not do anything really at all to pulled out. He's no Checo. I know you sent in the Slack chat. Perhaps we treated him too harshly. I think we did treat Checo a little too harshly because it was kind of like using a picket fence with a lot of openings and then just walking right through. There was a meme I saw too. I'm talking about Yuki blocking Lando. It was like if you had a fence on the sidewalk but nothing in the grass you could walk around. That's pretty much what Yuki's defense was in this race to Lando and McLaren. So, but ultimately McLaren did everything they needed to do, and they won. I mean, they won fair and square. Not the Grand Prix, obviously, but the title. So yeah, congratulations to Lando, 35th driver to win a Formula One World Drivers' Championship. That's pretty impressive. This whole year, I never would have thought it was going to happen. I thought Oscar had it in the bag, and he clearly fumbled that bag dramatically. And then same, even with Max, I still think even the odds makers were more confident in Max Verstappen than Lando Norris. But he did what he needed to do, and you got to tip the cap to him. So that's my long answer to that question. But yeah, shout out Lando and McLaren. World Drivers and Constructors Championships. It seems like with the Max era and having no teammate, it doesn't seem like we see that a lot in more recent memory. But hey, they won both titles. That's what they want to do. Now they can relax until, I guess, tomorrow when the test happens, their off-season test, the first one. So no days off for that organization.
Yeah, Matthew. I don't really have much more to add from what you just said, but I'm sure McLaren happy that everything, well, with the season and all that, the calendar finally come to an end, because, like you were saying, if that was another race, it probably would have been game over for them, because winning the championship by a couple of points, that's literally, winning by the skin of your teeth, because Max Verstappen and Red Bull, they really found something special, in the second half of the season, and he was like really coming for both McLaren drivers, and for today, I'm sure McLaren's glad that that nothing went terribly wrong for them. They were able to run a straightforward race, no issues at all, and ended with Lando Norris being this year's Formula One world champion, and it was really nice to see so many drivers congratulating them, happy for Lando and everything that he's able to do, because I remember just a few years ago when Lando Norris was relatively unknown. I think Jeff Gluck reshared the photo. I remember it was like Jimmy Johnson and Fernando Alonso meeting for the very first time, one of NASCAR's most accomplished champions ever, and then Fernando with a couple of Formula One world championships themselves. They're having a conversation. Who's this guy sitting on the couch watching the two motorsports legends talk? It was a young Lando Norris who was young and unproven at the time, and it's really crazy, you fast forward several years, and that young kid, who most people had no idea about, watching two great drivers from their respective disciplines have a conversation. Now Lando Norris, has put his name in the history books as a Formula One world champion. Just think it's really cool to see where he was back then, watching two legends, talk about their racing, and then you see Lando, several years later come forward and, become, put his name in the history books of Formula One. Yes, kudos to McLaren for being able to seal the deal. But like I said last week, yes, great that they were able to do this. They can celebrate and all of that. But if I'm Zach Brown, Andrea Stella, I'm still not happy with how this season ended, because it could have been lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's catch up on a couple of comments from the chat here. Good to see our own Joe Samiego in the chat as well. Red Bull ran out of time. Yeah, I got to tell you, if there was one race left, the gap being down at 2 points, I think Max Verstappen is on a bit of a win streak here. I think he would be the clear favorite, but just ran out of races here, 24 down, and Lando Norris is your champion. Spacebird founder here in the chat as well. You can say the same thing about any F1 world champion. They all start young. Yes, it's kind of necessary nowadays with how serious everybody takes it at such a young age here. And who would have thought, that when Lando Norris was receiving that trophy at the same time Nico Rosberg was, and saying he wants to be where Nico is one day, but just 9 years later, he'd be a world champion as well. And McLaren does hold on despite perhaps you could say their best efforts, or maybe their worst efforts to choke it away. Lando Norris is still able to clinch the championship. Oscar Piastri, unfortunately, has to settle for third. So on that note, as we mentioned, only 2 points away from a championship was Max Verstappen. It's well documented how Max almost overcame a staggering 104-point gap to Oscar Piastri. He did finish ahead of Piastri, and that 104-point gap came after Max's home race, the Dutch Grand Prix. That was the race where Lando Norris also had troubles of his own, an oil leak taking him out towards the finish, him coming away with no points from that race weekend. But it's still not enough after all of that, through everything for Max Verstappen to win his 5th consecutive World Championship. We know there were missed opportunities for all 3 drivers at different points throughout the year that could have closed the gap or made a difference and ultimately changed the outcome. Kobe, which driver is probably feeling more dejected right now in this moment? Is it Max Verstappen or is it Oscar Piastri?
I think hands down it has to be Oscar Piastri because Max Verstappen, he's carried this attitude, like I just don't care, like what happens if I win it, or if I lose it, oh well, because given how this season started for Red Bull, he had to come from over 100 points back. Max was just like, he was so nonchalant about everything, and I truly believe that he was so unbothered, like he said entering the weekend. He said, I got 4 of these at home, so he's good. So Max doesn't necessarily need to get a 5th. Well, he didn't need to get a 5th Formula One World Championship, since he said he already has 1, 2, 3, 4 of those back at his home. But Oscar Piastri, considering how his season started, you really thought he was going to be the championship favorite, because in the first half of the season, he was getting the best of his teammate Lando Norris, and also Max Verstappen as well. And then once we got to that second half of the season, when McLaren started to slide downhill, it was really Oscar who was the one who was struggling the most. I feel like Lando, peaked at the right time, and Oscar peaked, way too soon. And I still don't understand what on earth happened to Oscar Piastri in the second half of the season, because I looked like that this was going to be his championship. Then all of a sudden, he's sliding down, from first to second, and then third, in the drivers' championship. And I'm sure Oscar's going to be able to take a lot of things from this season, learn from it, and try to come back next year and try to be the top driver at McLaren and end up winning his first F1 World Championship. But Oscar, obviously very classy today. Congratulating Lando, and happy for the team. Being able to have one of their guys secure the drivers' championship, and also clinching the constructors' championship several races before as well. But all in all, Oscar has to feel the most disappointed, because it seemed like that this was his year to win this world championship, and it somehow slipped away, as he seemed to be the McLaren driver who ran into more of the issues compared to Lando.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get I don't have Diet Baja Blast, but I did go down to Charlotte area for a week, which is about 13 hours from my house. So I got Sundrop, Diet Sundrop specifically, not available in my region. So I'm going to pop this one for you, Ben. And shout out Kobe, the area. I love it. Love that area. I had a lot of fun. But I agree 100% with what Kobe said. With Oscar specifically, I do want to touch on Max, because I think he's somewhat dejected, but not in that same way. Because Oscar had I want to read that, though. Oscar's a future F1 champion. He will learn from this year, but next year's a whole new ballgame, and it's anyone's championship. Absolutely, right? It's a reset. We did all this for this whole year, and now pretty much as soon as Lando crossed the line and the results were official, now it resets. Everyone's at 0 again. So I agree 100%. But with Oscar, I think he's definitely the most dejected, because he had people saying, wow, where did this kid come from? And he was really putting belt to butt. And then all of a sudden, it's like he forgot how to drive. And I don't know if Max made a comment like that, which we'll touch on Max's humor and just like what Kobe had mentioned too. But I think the nail in the coffin for Oscar was, I would say Azerbaijan, if I'm saying that right. I apologize if I don't. I mean, this is a guy who was on the podium every week except the first Grand Prix of the year. And so starting in China when he won, podium every single race. And then the worst week I think we've ever seen him have. And then all of a sudden, it's like never was the same. And that's when Lando decided to pick it up. And that's why we're having this conversation today. So I think for Oscar, a couple things kind of mess with him. And I think we all said, it's me specifically, so I'll take the blame for some of this. I said Oscar was unbreakable mentally. It was like he had this calm poise against him. And I think even in this race today, I would argue he had that calm poise. But it's like still something broke. It was like after Azerbaijan, after being on the podium literally every single race except the opening Grand Prix of the year, 4th, 5th, 5th, disqualified, which then again, what do you do? And then he got back on the podium for the final 2 races, including a sprint win. So that broke him. That right after Azerbaijan broke him. And then certain things along the lines too. I think the whole papaya rules. I know we'll touch on that. The swapping positions. I think Monaco, when he didn't qualify as well, I think that hurt him too in the long run. And then trying to think what other things happened. I mean, Qatar, he didn't really do that well. He didn't really make up the gap. And then Austria, he did battle a little too hard against Max at the start, and he really lost a lot of time and lost the podium, I would argue, there too. And then just the strategy, I think a couple times it just did not work out in his favor, whether that was McLaren's call or Oscar's call or Lando's call, whoever. He literally choked that away. And looking back, and there have been, I think I tweeted sometime in September, somebody was being sarcastic, and it was like, Oscar's blah, blah, blah. I'm like, Oscar's got this in the bag. Man, I was wrong. So I apologize for that. So, yeah, I think he's ejected, not to keep ranting, but I do want to touch on Max Verstappen, and his dejection's probably different, right? He didn't expect to be there. His mother and father were not there. He even said that the only reason why he was really there is because of McLaren messing up and not him doing well. And he said, like Kobe had mentioned, well, I have 4 of those at home. I think Max is one of those guys could retire right now and does not care. I mean, he's making a minimum of $65 million a year in salary, not even including other sponsorship deals. He's fine. He's got a family now. I mean, Max wants to go sim racing. He does not care. He's like that kid in school who just happens to be really talented at something, and they might enjoy it, but they're like, I don't want to really do this forever. And Max is still in his mid to late 20s, so yeah, but there are a couple moments I want to highlight which lost Max Verstappen this championship year. One, and then I would say you can argue the same thing with McLaren having certain issues with mechanical stuff, and then obviously running into each other. And I think it was Coda that happened. But for Max Verstappen specifically, one you would argue Kimi Antonelli, I joked in the Slack chat, whether it was Austria and running into Max, taking him out of the race, cost very valuable points for Max, which he would have scored more than enough in that race to win. I mean, we don't know, he could have DNF later. And then obviously at Qatar losing that final spot to Lando, Kimi, when he went off track and lost it a little bit, that kind of cost him a little bit. But then you look, I think we forget about the Miami sprint, right? Got that penalty, finishes 17th, I believe it was, way outside the points. It technically was the first time Max Verstappen had finished any sort of race outside the points in like 2016. I know that streak's still intact because the sprints don't count the same, but that was one thing. I mean, Max in Red Bull, they made an error there. The Spanish Grand Prix, too. I think a lot of people forget about that, too. The contact with George Russell going from 5th to 10th because of the 10-second penalty. That's a lot of points Max Verstappen could have had if it wasn't for the overly aggressive driving. And then you argue that the strategy calls, whether it was Monaco and stuff like that, that was another one too. But yeah, those are a couple times I think Max they didn't make a lot of mistakes, except the car was literally the 5th fastest car on the grid of team-wise. I mean, it was terrible at the start of the year, but it was still Max Verstappen. So he still obviously made it to where he was. And I think if they made a change to the car 2 weeks earlier or whatever it was, Max would be a 5-time champion, but he's not. So these are a lot of hypotheticals. But he lost a lot of big points for certain errors, whether it was Miami and whether it was in Spain. So, yeah, it's one of those things. That's probably why he's dejected if he's going to look at that. Now we won't see Max Verstappen with the number 1, and I don't think we'll see him with the number 33 either. With new rule changes, he can pick whatever number he wants. I don't know, is Max Verstappen going to go number 3? What's he going to do? Sorry for the very long answer. Just wanted to touch on what Kobe said, as well as explain why Max, I feel, could also feel dejected in some ways.
Yeah, well, and Michael Schumacher's record still intact, 5 consecutive World Drivers' Championships. Max comes up short, just as Lewis did in 2020, just as Sebastian Vettel did in 2014. Now, let's continue on here with the stream. And again, apologies, trying to find my place here in the script again. There we go. Now, for McLaren, this is a big relief, as we've been talking about, because the history books will show that they have swept the Constructors and the Drivers' Championships. But for anyone who looks back on the whole season and how the championship evolved right down to the wire, the fact that the Drivers' Championship almost slipped away will remain on the minds of many of the Papaya faithful for a long time, I'm sure. Maybe not as long as it would have had Max close the deal and stolen the championship today, though. But Matthew, we'll go back to you first on this one. After all the celebrations, where does McLaren go entering and preparing for 2026 with Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, the papaya rules, all of the above?
Yeah, I promise this answer won't be nearly as long. McLaren, I think they internally caused some conflict between Oscar and Lando that I think we all said before, whether it was back in April, that if they lose this championship, it's because of the inner battle between them, like a Nico and Lewis, wasn't because of someone else. And then you could argue they almost lost it because not only Max, but because of that internal battle they had. So I think McLaren's focus for 2026, I mean, they went from not scoring at all just a few years ago, and one of the worst teams in the entire, I almost said league, but in the entire sport, to all of a sudden winning constructors championships. So I think what you have to do now is I guess Lando's a world champion now. That's great. Let's see if you can get Oscar the world championship. I think I'm not going to accuse McLaren of favoring Lando over Oscar, but I'm not going to, if you told me that you think that McLaren favors Lando over Oscar, I'm not going to disagree with you, but I'm not going to go into depth with that conversation. So I think with that, let them race now. We don't know what these new regulations could be. Hell, I mean, even Ferrari could probably figure something out. Maybe not. They should have after this year. Completely just terrible year for that organization. And Mercedes might be good. I think Kimi Antonelli's coming into his own. I think George Russell is one of the most underrated drivers on the grid. I think if Williams can continue to, there might be a real fight with these new regulations next year. So I think if you're McLaren, you just got to keep doing what you're doing. You were the best team in the sport most of the year. You have, I'm not going to say you have the best driver in the sport because you don't. I don't care if he's world champion or not. But you have maybe two of the top three best drivers in the sport right now. And you just got to, you celebrate and you move on. You keep doing what you do best. And that's win races, get on the podium multiple times a year, and let the drivers fight each other. Not physically, but like on track. No more Monza place swaps because of a bad pit stop. No more the year before with the whole sprint race, letting Oscar ahead to win the race because of stuff. Stop with that stuff. Just let him race. Honestly, that's how I feel about that. But I'm very excited to see 2026 what these regulations can bring and see if it's more of a even playing field because it wasn't this year.
Yeah, I certainly think McLaren, should obviously, celebrate their championship and all of that, and the drivers with Lando, and then, obviously the constructors, because it's a huge accomplishment to do that in Formula One. But once all of that is over, they need to do a full evaluation of everything that really happened this year. And I think I used the example on last week's show that if McLaren is able to pull out this year's world championship, it's kind of like a stat line that we saw in the NFL years ago with Nathan Peterman, where you throw like no touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and you still somehow end up winning the game. And I have a feel, and that's basically how I can describe this year's championship winning campaign for McLaren. That you put up an ugly stat line in some respects, and still ended up winning. In which to their relief, as you said, Ben, to be able to accomplish this feat this year when it looked like it was all going to go wrong. And I think that McLaren needs to go through all of their processes and look through absolutely everything, figure out like what they're going to do, when it comes to the papaya rules and managing their drivers, and make sure that they aren't putting, the team at risk in these situations, because what happened, last week at Qatar absolutely cannot happen on a regular basis in 2026, where you effectively, take your chances of winning the race away. I still have no idea to, 1 week later, why they, decided to leave both of their drivers out instead of calling them to the pits with everyone else. Even Hannah from Red Bull, was really confused as to why they were staying out, because literally everybody on the pit and all the other teams, the logical thing to do was to come pit, but they left their drivers out, and that wasn't the first baffling, strategy decision we've seen from McLaren this year. We like to make fun of Ferrari and their strategy, but you would think that the Ferrari strategists were working with McLaren, considering how bad some of the strategy was this year with McLaren. So I think that they just need to go through all of their processes and just make sure that, that they're going to be performing at a competent level, because throughout the year, despite winning the championship, we saw, quite a bit of incompetence from McLaren, whether, you want to blame Zach Brown at the very top or, Andrea Stella, everybody, needs to be held accountable for what went wrong. And because if they don't figure this out, if McLaren comes into new regulations, as one of the top teams again, they may not get as lucky in 2026, and end up, taking the championship like they did this year, because there was a lot of things that gone wrong. I think McLaren is lucky that, Lando ended up getting this, because as we've been saying, one more race, Max would have been a 5-time Formula One world champion.
Yeah, certainly McLaren have to be very lucky and very fortunate that the season has come to an end now, because I think the momentum that Max Verstappen had would have carried him to a world championship if there was even so much as just one race left here. But he does hang on and win the championship. Lando does, but I think the questions will remain. Certainly down in Australia, they even have the politicians talking about whether or not Oscar Piastri was at a disadvantage the second half of this year. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But of course, the grid could look very different next year with new regulations coming in, so we'll have to keep an eye on that as well. Now, at the end of it all, the race played out with little to no controversy compared to 2021. We did see a moment where Lando was under investigation for possibly going off track and gaining an advantage. Yuki Tsunoda was the one who was handed a 5-second time penalty for moving more than once in defense. Lando was not given a penalty for track limits, despite being very close to outside of the white line when he made the pass on Tsunoda, but you can wonder if the stewards maybe decided that it was Yuki's move that had forced him over there. Obviously, Lando not wanting to take any major risks, trying to be as careful as he could as he worked his way up through traffic again, but ultimately not given a penalty for track limits. We didn't have much on-track action besides that. Once the field got spread out, this race did have a lot of hype and media attention coming into it, really for the first time since 2021, when there was a championship on the line, a driver's championship at least. Obviously, there was the constructors last year as well, but all the prestige is with the drivers. There was a lot of prestige on the line heading into this race, and yet I think a lot of people might have considered it a bit of a snoozer. So, Kobe, we'll go to you first here. How do you view this weekend if you're F1 and Liberty Media? Do you look at this as kind of a snoozer of a race, or is it still a big success with the pomp and circumstance of a championship? Is Abu Dhabi still the right track to host the F1 finale?
I guess it doesn't matter if we think if it's the right track to host the finale, because I know they signed this long-term deal for it to continue being the finale for many years in the future. So it doesn't that's going to be changing anytime soon. They've done different things, with this Abu Dhabi, the Yas Marina Circuit, to try to make it more compelling. I mean, the previous layout we used, was obviously not great. And then they decided a few years ago to create a revised circuit and try to create more overtaking opportunities where you can dive bomb and all of that. And yeah, we've seen a few overtakes, mostly I guess in Formula 2, in those places. But it just really seems like that, Abu Dhabi, yes, it has the pomp and circumstance, where people will want to, come out to the track, and see the glitz and glamour that is Formula One. But from strictly an on-track product perspective, I don't think Abu Dhabi is the right place, to host a Formula One finale. Remember in the past, used to host a finale at Interlagos, and I thought, that was a nice venue to have the F1 season finale and all of that. And I guess if you really wanted to get big, why not have it in Las Vegas? I think that would be a lot of fun, for America to host the season finale at Formula One. But that's obviously not going to be happening anytime soon. But if we had a say in all this, I would really like to see the championship, go to a different location, or maybe even rotate, like the model that NASCAR is going to be bringing in the next couple of years, where different tracks are going to be in a group on a rotating basis, where the championship will be here for a few years, and then it, just keeps moving around. So it's, not just one track, hosting the season finale. But I still think Formula One and Liberty Media have to be very happy that the championship, went down to the final weekend, because there were a lot of storylines heading into this weekend. Whether Lando Norris we're going to be able to hold on, could Max Verstappen, complete one of the most impressive comebacks in Formula One history, or could Oscar Piastri, despite his chances of winning this championship being unlikely, could he find a way to get it done? And, people kept talking about Formula One until the very end of the season, because if this had been wrapped up, a lot sooner, it just would have been just another race weekend. Be like, we're just tuning in to watch the last race of the year, and that's that. But they had a lot of hype and media coverage coming into this weekend, wondering what on earth was going to happen, and whether it would be, like 2021, where you had like fireworks and explosions, hopefully in a more positive way this time. But this race today, it didn't really have a whole lot of action. So I think from that perspective, obviously, very disappointing. But it is typical Abu Dhabi, because you're probably not gonna get an exciting on-track product, given the history of this track and even the revised layout didn't really help out much at all. But Formula One Liberty Media have to be happy it went down to the final weekend.
Yeah, I agree 1000%. It was like all the stars aligned for Formula One and Liberty Media with all the storylines, and I frankly don't think they cared about the racing product. I think they got what they wanted with Max Verstappen win and how Lando needed to finish at least third to keep that title, and he still finished third, and Oscar being right there in second. It was one of those things where everything that they wanted to happen on paper, I think, happened. But I think Kobe is 100% right. I think Abu Dhabi, it was not really worth the 3 hours and 8 minutes of sleep I got. I closed my eyes at 4:55. All of a sudden, it was 8 o'clock, and I turned my TV on for the formation lap. That's how my morning went. So it was. I don't think they cared about the on-track product. I think it could have been like, was it Monaco this year? Was like the first time in history, and one of the first times. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Where like the top 10 didn't change positions, and the starting 10 finished in the top 10. I think that was Monaco, but that could have literally happened today, and they still would have been satisfied based on what had happened, because it kind of did in certain ways with the qualifying and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a snoozer of a race. They should definitely not be at Abu Dhabi at the end of the year, but it is what it is. They signed a long-term contract to do it. I think Interlagos would be awesome. I even think somewhere like Mexico City would be fun, just based on the environment. Anywhere Las Vegas. I would rather have COTA. I mean, Vegas is the idea of it, right? I think NASCAR 2 at Las Vegas would be a fun championship ending. To have both NASCAR and Formula One there would be pretty cool. But yeah, I think it's cool that they have it on like an actual circuit. But yeah, the product wasn't great, and I honestly think it was incredible that the stars aligned to have 3 guys fighting for the championship at the last race of the year, because if they didn't, I probably would still be just waking up by now, because I probably wouldn't have woken up to watch this race. So very exciting. They got what they wanted. So congratulations to Formula One, and obviously end of an era with ESPN. I know Apple TV starts up, I guess whenever the season starts. So that's going to be very interesting to see. I have Apple TV, but still not a fan of that whole change. But to each their own with that. But yeah, and also I know, Ben, I would love if you would touch on this too. The post race was like, I know it's kind of changing the question, but in terms of it was like 2 minutes at most, and then it immediately cut to the lady at the end, or the woman at the end, where she was like,
"Yeah, sure,
this has been F1," and then it cut off. I was like, "What the hell?" Sorry, but yeah, I just wanted to add that to that.
And I know I said that message in our private chat as well, and just to put a bow on Abu Dhabi here, they got to figure something out with that track if it's going to be the finale for the next however many years. I know they've tweaked the layout a couple of times, but I would much rather be at Interlagos. I can't really name a memorable moment from that race that didn't also have the title decider factor to it. Like, you can think of 2010, obviously 2014, 16, and 21, and now obviously 25. But even this year, nothing I think is really going to. I mean, maybe we'll talk about that Lando pass on Yuki for a little while, but pretty straightforward race nonetheless. Obviously, it was tense with the championship on the line, but not a very compelling race. I think Interlagos would be much better. But yeah, a little disappointed in ESPN, especially since it's the end of an era. I know that, obviously their coverage is much different than NBC's was, but, NBC had a whole sign-off planned with all their hosts, and looking back at all the different moments. Obviously you can't really do that if you're ESPN, I guess, since you mostly just simulcast the Sky Sports feed. But for there to be basically none of that for their last race, maybe there was on ESPN3 or streaming online, I don't know. But in terms of linear television, like you said, Matthew, very quick sign-off. And, quite frankly, selfishly, again, I think as a whole, it will probably be a net negative going to streaming with Apple next year. But as somebody who's subscribed to Apple TV, and as somebody who took in the MLS Cup yesterday, and congratulations to Lionel Messi and Inter Miami on clinching that. But been very happy with the Apple coverage over there. It's just been an accessibility issue, but the MLS season pass is going away. Apple was on the air an hour before the game, and I think an hour and a half after the game ended with all their coverage and everything. So I'm hoping to see something similar when Formula One comes next year, and I'm hopeful that it will be top-notch coverage. Again, you just have to wonder how many people are going to drop the however many dollars a month or a year you need for Formula One. So we'll have to wait and see. But selfishly, like I said, I am looking forward to the coverage as a diehard fan. I just don't know how many of the ESPN newer fans or casual fans are going to follow over. I know Jeff Gluck posted that picture of the bar at Charlotte at 9:30 in the morning, packed, watching the conclusion of the F1 race. I don't know if you're going to get too many scenes like that if you go over to Apple TV. So that'll be something that we'll just have to wait and see going forward how that looks like next year. Now let's round off Formula One here with some other notables, go through the rest of the Drivers' Championship standings. Obviously, Lando, Max, and Oscar, your top three. George Russell, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Antonelli, Alex Albon, Carlos Sainz, and Fernando Alonso make up the rest of the top 10. 11th through 19th are Nico Hulkenberg, Isaac Hadjar, Oliver Behrman, Liam Lawson, Esteban Ocon, and Lance Stroll, both getting around Yuki Tsunoda, who falls to 17th. You got to feel for him. Pierre Gasly and Gabriel Bortoleto. The only car that did not score this season was the second Alpine. Franco Colapinto's 11th place finish of the Dutch Grand Prix was the closest that car came to finishing in the points, so he gets 20th on countback. Jack Doohan listed as 21st in the championship. In the constructors, McLaren obviously clinched it weeks ago. Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, and Williams make up the rest of the top five. Racing Bulls hang on to 6 despite a double points finish from Aston Martin today, while Haas, Sauber, and Alpine round off those standings. Between McLaren and Max Verstappen, the only other driver who won this season was George Russell. He took 2 victories in his Mercedes. This was Yuki Tsunoda's last race as an F1 driver on the grid, at least for now. He will be a Red Bull reserve driver in 2026. And there will be 22 cars on the grid next year, with Cadillac bringing back drivers Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez. It's the last race for Sauber, with Audi coming in next year. Sauber's first race was the 1993 South African Grand Prix. The team scored a single win as BMW Sauber, with Robert Kubica at the 2008 Canadian Grand Prix. It's the last time we see a Renault engine on the grid as well, with Alpine having Mercedes engines next year. Boy, that's going to take some getting used to. Last race for Red Bull Honda, with Ford coming in 2026. And a season-long point system came down to the final lap in the final race of the year. What a concept. Matthew, what will you remember most from the 2025 Formula One season?
Oh, pretty much everything you said, right? There's so many things this was one of the first, I'm not going to say the first year, but I really paid attention, and it was fascinating. I think one thing I will really remember from, I guess, a fan perspective is the fact that the greatest driver of all time had one of his worst seasons ever in the Ferrari, and it was all hyped up. For him to not get a single podium after his worst season was 5 podiums the previous year. Lewis Hamilton in 18 years did not get a single podium this year. I know he won a sprint, but again, that's for me kind of one of the most things I remember. The fact that we really thought Ferrari, especially after last year, and Carlos Sainz is truly the most underrated driver on the grid. And then Lewis gets into the car, and it was just a struggle all season long. And even Charles, I know he still finished pretty well in the standings, just did not do well. It just wasn't one of those things for that. So I think Lewis too. And I think the excitement with watching Isaac Hadjar, watching Nico Hulkenberg, watching Kimi Antonelli get on the podium was so just enjoyable to watch. I think Nico's podium was pretty awesome. And so I think it was Silverstone. That was really a fun moment where it was finally. It's someone you root for. And then watching guys like Carlos Sainz getting 2 podiums with Williams was pretty awesome. I always remember that. Watching guys like Ollie Behrman really come into his own as a driver, I think was cool. And then, I guess Max almost winning the championship and McLaren almost blowing the championship is probably something I'll remember too. This was really a memorable season in a lot of aspects, I feel. But there's a lot, obviously new era starting. Red Bull going to Ford, like you had mentioned. Obviously Alpine new engines. There's going to be a lot of changes. But those are some of my most memorable things. But I think for me personally, watching Lewis Hamilton I'm not going to say regress, but finish 6th in the standings and consider it a horrible year. That was kind of tough. And I think that's a negative memory I think we'll all have with this season, watching him struggle. So hopefully he can get back for at least a couple more years, because if that Ferrari seat's open, there's a couple drivers that they could be looking at. But Lewis, I think still got that it factor. But so much to remember. I'm excited to hear what you guys will remember the most.
And one thing I believe that you didn't mention, in the things coming to an end, and also the last race for DRS. Yeah, so
yes, thank you.
DRS has been around for a very long time. It's gonna it's gonna feel extremely weird next year on lap 2 and lap 3. When I don't hear DRS has now been enabled. Yeah, that's something that's been just carved into my mind. For the longest time now. It's gonna be really strange. That they're gonna have a new device next year in replace of DRS, but. I'm just pulling up the Formula One point standings right now. Just gonna say what I remember as Matthew did, starting from the bottom. Alpine, not really the best year for them at all. I know they signed Pierre Gasly, to a long-term contract, to lead that team into the future. As Pierre, he said that he feels good about where they are long term. As 2025, seems like a throwaway year for him. As a he had a young teammate, Jack Doohan, to start off the season. Doohan didn't really have a chance, honestly, to do anything because it seemed like that he was out before the season even started. I remember when they had the big preview, to celebrate the 75th anniversary season of Formula One when they were in London, before Jack Doohan, even took the grid in Australia at his home Grand Prix for his very first, his very first race as a full-time Formula One driver. People are already asking Jack Doohan, if he was already out, which is super unfortunate for him. Really, really, really hate that for Jack. And we'll have to see what's next year. And, then I put Franco Colapinto into the seat. And out of all the, full-time drivers on the grid, Franco Colapinto was the only driver not to score a single point. So a lot of pressure will be on Franco to perform in 2026, or he could very well be out. And Gabriel Bortoleto thought he showed some bright spots, throughout the season, especially in the middle of the season when he was scoring some points. But his season didn't really end, the way that he wanted. But I certainly think, with obviously Salber's name going away, Audi coming in, hopefully they'll get some good resources to give him a good car. I think Gabriel Bortoleto can make some noise if you give him a much, better car. And, Yuki Tsunoda, finishing down, outside the top 15 in the points, extremely disappointing run for him. I don't think everything was Yuki's fault, considering how this Red Bull car was. But, at the end of the day, Formula One is a results business. And I do wonder if he had stayed on, with Racing Bulls, throughout the whole year and Red Bull didn't give up on Liam Lawson so soon. I wonder if Yuki would have had a seat for next year. But as we know, Max Verstappen is basically the teammate killer because it's so hard to perform against Max, with the car. A lot of us been saying it seems to be to his liking compared to all the others. And also, as we've been saying, we didn't appreciate Sergio Perez enough because Sergio Perez was in that second Red Bull seat this year. He would have certainly, gotten a lot more out of that car than Yuki Tsunoda did. Probably, not on the same level as Max Verstappen still, but just really hate that Yuki, is put in this position. But at the end of the day, it is what it is for him. And hopefully he can work his way back to the grid, as soon as 2027. And there's not really much to say, about Aston Martin. It feels like it was a write-off year for them, in hopes of 2026, because going to have an Adrian Newey design car. And we all know Adrian Newey's history with Red Bull. And if Adrian Newey can do what he's done with Red Bull, Aston Martin, that's something that team can get extremely excited about heading into next year. And we talked about on Grid Tonight recently, with Adrian Newey, alongside, him leading the engineering department. He's also been named the team principal as well for Aston Martin next year. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see how Adrian Newey is going to be able to, handle, the extra responsibility, not just, overseeing what's happening, with the car he designed, but also manage an entire team as well. That's going to be entirely new for Adrian. And on Grid Tonight, when we talked about this, it was one of the rare times, where we completely disagreed. I was on the island by myself thinking it was going to be interesting to see how Adrian was going to do. And I think that it could be a good thing for him. While Matt and Josh, they disagree with me. They said they thought it was a horrible decision because this is, it might be too much on Adrian's plate. And they'll be afraid that it could tarnish his legacy in Formula One if it goes really poorly for him as team principal. So that's, another story we're going to follow. And also one of the things that surprised me this year was, young Ollie Bearman outperforming Esteban Ocon. I thought Esteban, being the veteran he is in Formula One, I thought, he'd be the lead driver at Haas. But, Ollie Bearman got him this year in the driver standings, and did really well compared to his, veteran teammate. And it shows why, Ferrari has, thought so highly of Ollie Bearman. And this, and this is the reason why he's in Formula One in that Haas seat, with the Ferrari power unit, because Ferrari, wanted to put their development driver in a seat. And, we talked about Lewis Hamilton's struggles. If Lewis Hamilton, decides to bow out of Formula One, Ollie Bearman probably going to be the next driver in line to get a seat with Ferrari. And based on what he's been able to do with the Haas this year, I think, he'd be very, very deserving of that. And then you look, Racing Bulls drivers, Isaac Hadjar, Liam Lawson, I'm glad Liam was able to get back to a car that that he could drive, and I think he did as well as he possibly could have done, in a return to racing bulls, and I think it's really improved his confidence as well because he was at an all-time low, after only getting a couple of races at Red Bull, and then they decided to quit on him in that sense. And I think being in that environment and coming back next year alongside his new rookie teammate Arvid Lindblad from Formula 2, I think it's going to be good. For Liam to get some continuity there. And as a Hadjar, I thought he had a solid rookie campaign as well. Looking forward to seeing what he's able to do in Red Bull. Hopefully they give him a car that he can drive as well alongside Max Verstappen, because if Red Bull keep making the same mistakes and prioritizing Max in terms of how the car handles, Isaac Hadjar might become the next Yuki Tsunoda and be on the outs as well, with that organization. And you got to give a call to Nico Hulkenberg, just finishing outside the top 10 in points, I believe. He was able to drag that Sauber to a lot of finishes, where a lot of drivers probably wouldn't have been able to do. So I think if we're looking at like a overachiever of the year, I guess you could probably say Nico Hulkenberg, because he extracted the max potential of that Sauber car, and I don't feel like he's not getting enough credit for what he was able to do this year. And another great year, for Williams here on the up and up. Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon getting in the top 10 in points. I'm looking forward to seeing that Williams can continue its upward trajectory in 2026. And then, Ferrari, they finished, 5th and 6th in the Drivers' Championship, but, a lot of disappointment, from the Ferrari camp that had a lot of high hopes heading into this year. And we like to call them the Dallas Cowboys, of Formula One, because there's a lot of expectations each year that this is going to be Ferrari's year. And then, you just wait, because they're going to end up disappointing you. And, Charles Leclerc, he did the best he could, this year and all of that. But Lewis Hamilton, I think he's certainly going to need an offseason, to get away from everything. In his post-race interviews, he's obviously been dejected, throughout the year, but he seemed to be at an all-time low today. He's saying that he's basically going to, just toss his phone away during the offseason, say he doesn't want to talk to no one and have no interactions with anyone. He wants to completely disconnect, from Formula One, given how difficult it's been. And yeah, Matthew, you mentioned, Lewis had a sprint race win in Shanghai earlier this year, but it's kind of a moot point because that was such a long time ago. It seemed like it's in ancient history, and it's just been a really rough year for Lewis. This is something that he's never experienced in Formula One before. It's crazy that he didn't have a single podium this year, went winless, and nothing just seemed to go right. And Lewis, he just seems to be depressed right now. So hopefully he'll get himself, right mentally and come back in 2026 stronger than ever before. I know it's, former teammate at Mercedes, Nico Rosberg, was telling, they said, Lewis, you can't quit and retire like this, that there's still a lot, for Lewis to accomplish in Formula One, even though, I believe he's obviously past his prime in Formula One. I still think, that the talent is there. If you give Lewis a great car, that he can go out there and get results. I don't know if he's the same Lewis Hamilton who can win over 10 Grand Prix races, in a single year, but I certainly think he still has some left in the tank. So hopefully with next year's car design, that Ferrari can, try to get on the podium more often, and get those race wins, so Lewis Hamilton can show what he's capable of. And then you have to look at the Mercedes duo as well. Yeah, I thought George Russell did, the best he could with the Mercedes car that was given to him this year. Thought he did a great job leading the team. And Kimi Antonelli, been a roller coaster season for him. First, early in the year of his rookie campaign, he started to look really good. And then, got to the European side of the season, and then he completely went downhill. And it seemed like things got worse, when there was uncertainty about the contract situation, when there was a chance that Max Verstappen was going to become available. Obviously, Mercedes looked to see if it was a possibility, because if a Max Verstappen is on the market, you'd be stupid enough, not to at least, do your homework and try to make something like that happen. So, but once, they found out, Max was staying at Red Bull and there was nothing they could really do, they were able to, re-sign George and bring Kimi back. And then once, that pressure was off, it seemed like, Kimi started to figure things out in the last half of the season. I know today's, Abu Dhabi Grand Prix didn't necessarily go well for Kimi, but he's certainly have to be happy here in Mercedes, and hopefully some of the bright spots you saw in the second half of the season, that's something that Kimi can build on heading into 2026. And we've really, said everything there is to say, about Max Verstappen and the great comeback that he was able to have. It would have been nice to see if Max, was able to completely come back. I'm sure it has to sting, coming up a couple of points short there, but nothing to be ashamed of, because earlier in the season we thought he was truly out of it, and for this Red Bull team to be able to rally after all the turmoil they had, that Christian Horner there and Max's father, they obviously had conflict, and then last year, you had Adrian Newey, bowing out as well. It's just a whole bunch of drama behind the scenes at Red Bull, and for Lauren Mekies to be able to come in, get that team together, tune out all the drama and just focus on going out there and racing. And I think Red Bull, deserves a lot of credit for the effort they were able to have this year, and what was a wonderful recovery effort. And at the end of the day, McLaren got the constructors. Lando's the world champion. Oscar had a great season as well. It's going to be interesting to see what the pecking order is going to look like next year, to see if Lando can try to repeat as a Formula One world champion, or if Oscar can try to get the redemption and get the one that seemingly slipped away from him.
I just want to make one thing clear before we move on here, because I did leave a comment in the chat room of your show Wednesday night, Kobe, about Lando Norris and the possibility of team orders, and saying that if this happens in light of the collapse and Oscar, if he just lays over and lets Lando through for a championship, he would perhaps be viewed as the least deserving champion we've ever seen in this sport. I want to make it very clear. Lando Norris is absolutely a deserving champion, and he put in a fantastic drive today. He did lose out to his teammate on the start, but he did everything that he needed to do. He went out and got the third place finish that he needed, and it wasn't always easy for him when he came out after his pit stop. He had some traffic to navigate, and I mean, my goodness, how quickly must the walls have felt like they were closing in as he was moving to the left side of Yuki Tsunoda's Red Bull and trying to get that overtake taken care of. And really the only super tense moment of the race, I guess, on the pit wall when that move was under investigation, but obviously all that got cleared out. So thorough congratulations to Lando Norris, completely deserving, as I think any of the three would have been, to be quite honest. I think very fitting that even though it wasn't the same order as the championship standings, but those were the three on the podium here today in the final race, all putting in stellar drives to close out their 2025 seasons. I'm glad both of you mentioned Lewis Hamilton, and I got to tell you, I was kind of torn watching the closing laps of Silverstone, because I said, okay, either Lewis Hamilton's going to keep his Silverstone podium streak alive, or Nico Hulkenberg's finally going to break that podium-less drought that has been with him his entire career and get rid of one of the most unwanted records in F1 history. And I thought to myself, Lewis hasn't had a podium all year, but he still won the sprint in China. He's still got the second half of the season. He's been in the points pretty much every weekend. He's surely going to get a podium at some point this year. This might have been Nico's one and only chance, depending on how the rest of the season plays out. So I was very happy that he rounded off the podium at Silverstone. Never could have imagined that Lewis Hamilton would go through the entire season. I didn't expect him to win the 8th championship this year. I didn't even expect him to beat Leclerc in the standings. I thought Leclerc would have the upper hand because he's been at Ferrari a lot longer. It's a new environment for Lewis to be learning coming in this stage in his career. So I thought 2026 was always going to be the main target year for him, but it was just an incredibly rough season for him, especially the second half, and certainly have to hope that he can turn things around, because I think we saw it when he won Silverstone last year in the Mercedes, and what felt like his last real victory. I know he won Spa later that year as well on the technicality after Russell was disqualified, but you saw how the fans reacted to that. I think everybody would be quite happy to see Lewis Hamilton have a bit of a resurgence again. Michael Schumacher even got that one podium in 2012 when he came back with Mercedes. We'll see if Lewis can have some similar moments next year in 2026 with Ferrari. All right, well, that's going to wrap up our Formula One coverage. Thank you all for sticking with us. We do have another race to recap right now as well. We end one season and we start another, season 12, 2025-26 for the Formula E World Championship. They are underway as of this weekend as well. 20 cars in the field this year, with the departure of, ironically, McLaren, and only 14 finished the race. At the end, it was Jake Dennis who survived to earn his first win since Scuderia E-Prix in season 10. He started the race from first position after the pole sitter Pascal Wehrlein was handed a 3-place grid penalty. Now, this race was super competitive, and it was a late safety car that allowed him and his teammate Felipe Drugovich to get attack mode after the safety car when other drivers had already completed their 2 required attack mode sessions. A late red flag for a major crash involving Pepe Marti. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. But that led to a 1-lap sprint to the finish, but no change up front. Jake Dennis, Oliver Rowland, your defending champion, and Nick Cassidy were your podium finishers. So, Kobe, the late safety car gave Andretti drivers a big advantage, both of them. Had that not occurred, how wide open do you think this race would have been?
Oh yeah, I had a feeling if it wasn't for that late safety car, I think the race would have been more wide open than what it was. But you got to tip your hat, to Jake Dennis, for being able, to perfectly execute the strategy throughout the race. And it was just like Formula E. I don't know what this season is going to entail, but based on all of the different changes for the lead and swaps of positions, might want to think about bringing out the Formula E Wheel of Destiny, because I had no idea who was going to win this race, because at one point, so Jake Dennis up front, and, you had, what's his name, Pascal Verlaine as well. Nick Cassidy got up there. There was just a whole bunch of, different drivers up there. And it was just really competitive, really great to see that, for Formula E. But yeah, I feel like the safety car, messed things up at the end. I know, it had the red flag, to clean up the debris from Pepe Marti's car, and then to obviously make sure the track safe for racing conditions. And then there at the end, when we had that final lap shootout, there wasn't really much overtaking, because there was, like, at that point positions were just really set in stone. But I have to feel for Felipe Drukovich, making his Formula E debut, since obviously he never got an opportunity with Aston Martin in Formula One, and his first race is his home E-Prix in Sao Paulo. And if it wasn't for that safety car, Drukovich, with the attack mode and all that, and all the extra horsepower he had, it looked like he was gonna be on tap for a podium in his Formula E debut at home. That would have been real special for him. But it was just, for that final lap, it was just really hard to overtake, and there was nothing that none of the others could really do at that point, because Jake Dennis, he had it in the bag.
Absolutely. Nothing makes me happier than watching an open wheel race, specifically like a Formula FIA type of race, where of the top 10 qualifiers, I would say top 9 here, only 3 of the guys who finished inside the top 9 or top 10 started inside the top 9. I think that's pretty crazy, right? Besides Jake Dennis, who won the race, which, I mean, he did everything he needed to do to win. Pascal Verlaine starting 4th because he was on pole, then obviously the grid penalty. And then Nick DeVries finishing 9th after starting 5th. Everyone else was not in the top, were not in single-digit qualifying positions. That's exciting to me, especially in a new era of Formula E, where Oliver Rowland can come from 13th to finish 2nd, where Nick Cassidy can come from 15th to finish on the podium in 3rd, where Nick Cassidy, I believe when he got attack mode, I was excited. I was texting the Slack chat. I think he passed 12 cars within a lap, Nick Cassidy, because he took the attack mode early. And it was just so awesome to watch, just go right around on the outside. So for Formula E specifically, I think this race showed how wide open it could really be. And I think that's super exciting when you can see that much parity in a sport where I know some people are like, well, we want to see the cars and the driver. I like an idea where I know it's way too early, right? It's only the first Grand Prix of the year, especially with this new car. But I love the idea that there is so much talent in Formula E and that it really does not matter where you start because you can still finish really well. And you saw, obviously, world champion Oliver Rowland gain 11 spots, and then Nick Cassidy, one of the best drivers in the sport, who that championship is eluding him, gained 12 spots to get on the podium, too. That's just super exciting. Obviously, first podium for that team, too, with Nick Cassidy. So, yeah, I think, too, that I know we're going to talk about the safety car. It did give them the advantage. It also killed the advantage for everyone else. I mean, most of the grid took their final attack mode, and then the safety car came out, and then the red flag, and I was like, oh, that kind of sucks. I wish there was a way they could fix that. I hate to see people, I can't think of an appropriate way to describe it. I hate to see people get, I guess, screwed is the nicest way to put it. I feel you could, if that's too bad, because taking it and then something out of their hands falls, like a flipping Formula E car. Literally, a flipping Formula E car causes all that. So, yeah, I think it was crazy. I was really hoping. I always have liked Felipe Drugovich, especially since I paid attention to open wheel racing, seeing what he's been able to accomplish, and to him not even getting a fair chance to race in Formula One. I think that's disgusting. Well, there's nothing he could really do about it now at this point. I hope he can do very successful things because it didn't work out for him, and maybe he can get a shot somewhere down the line, whether it's IndyCar, whether it's another open wheel series too. But yeah, that late safety car gave those drivers a big advantage, and I think we saw for the first race in this new generation that there is going to be a lot of different winners. I think we can hope for this year. I think most of the grid is really capable of winning, and it depends on how the cautions fall and stuff. But I couldn't tell you Formula E, the favorite for the title. I really couldn't. I think every other sport you kind of have your couple favorites, but you can argue Jake Dennis, Rowland, Cassidy, Verline. Even someone like Drogovic, if he can come in, Felix da Costa, even Taylor Barnard showed a lot of promise too. Any one of those guys, I really feel can go out and win the title. And this is just week one, so very early in the year. Obviously, still got a really long way to go. But yeah, that's my long rant about Formula E. I was so excited on Roku, I was able to watch it, and it was at a reasonable time where I didn't have to wake up at 3 a.m. to watch the Grand Prix, or E-Prix, I should say. Yeah, I was excited. That's what I gotta say.
Well, the race had 2 fewer laps than last year. We didn't see a big pack of cars drafting and trading off the lead like we have in the past. No laps were added after the safety car. That allowed for flat-out racing, including the lap after the red flag. And Matthew, to your point, the field looks very competitive. We saw how unpredictable the qualifying session even was, and then, of course, what we saw in the race. But some people perhaps thinking the attack mode might have been too powerful. Attack mode, 4-wheel drive activated, more horsepower, of course, now seen as mostly an offensive move. We saw drivers come from the back to the front. You didn't really see as much of it being used to defend positions against other drivers. With 2 attack modes, we saw positions shuffling like a race where tire wear mattered, and we still had the physical close quarters racing people remembered before the Peloton era. Matthew, was this the right step for Formula E to improve the on-track product, and are any further adjustments needed, although, like you mentioned, it is still early?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, Ben, where absolutely I think this is the right step. And I think a lot of sports almost beg for more power. And now Formula E is one of those first ones that have given people what they want. And I think the drivers wanted it too. And there was a lot of passing. I think a lot of people, there's stereotypical ways why people hate Formula E and stuff. Obviously, the technology, the electric, no sound, or even though there is sound. But the fact that there was that much offense and that much power in these cars, I think could really start bringing more people into the sport. And sure, I think Formula E is the definition of always constant improvement. Because if you compare even season 1 versus season 12 now, a lot of changes have been made. And I think it's incredible what we've been able to witness, that from the not only the racing standpoint, but the technology standpoint, what we've gotten. And I think it gives promise to other sports down the line to maybe adapt to some of the technologies that Formula E and ABB specifically have been able to show. I know NASCAR is working on an electric possible series with ABB, and just it's awesome. I just love the idea of technology just giving people another thing to consume, a medium of racing, pretty much. But yeah, I think definitely the right spot to improve this on-track product. I can't really tell you what else they can do. I mean, I wish there was a way that attack mode you couldn't get, I guess, screwed for lack of a better term. I apologize. But then again, that's part of the strategy, part of the race. Yeah, I think a long way to go too. I think Formula E is really. I can't wait to see in another, if it still exists in another 12 seasons from now, what we can compare in say 2037, if it's still there, versus what we saw back in the early 2010s. So yeah, I'm super excited to see, and I think this was definitely a right step. But then comparing it to other stuff, we are very excited, but it is only one E-Prix. We've only seen 30 laps of this technically. I think it was 30. So we got a long way to go. I'm very excited for this season.
Yeah, for sure, Matthew. I don't really have much more to add, but I'm sure when Formula E first came around, we never expected it to last, this long. So it wouldn't surprise me if it's still around in like 2037, and really looking forward to seeing what they have next year with the new generation car. It is the last year of the current regulations, and they've already teased, next year's car, which is insanely quicker than what we currently have. I remember the first generation of Formula E car when you had the 2 cars where you run half of the race in one car, and then you had to pull into the garage, hop out of that one, and then get in another car and then go out there and do your thing. It was, so we've come a long way, in electric racing from that first season where you couldn't even make it one race, on the same car where you needed 2 cars per race. And now, the cars are, continue to get faster, and next year's cars, going to be even quicker. So Formula E is really doing big things right now in the world of motorsports. And yeah, with the new attack mode rules, it really seems to be working, where you just won't use it to defend, and then it's harder to overtake because now you have a lot more strategy, with the attack mode, and then obviously with the races where you have the pit boost and all of that, where now you can use your strategy, figuring out, like when to deploy your attack mode and all of that. And you can really set yourself up to have a good finish, as we saw yesterday, before the safety car, if it had gone green, it looks like Andretti was going to be on his way to a 1-2 finish, in the Sao Paulo E-Prix, and some of the others as well who had their attack modes there at the end. They would have been able to, really push, and there's, nothing the driver ahead could have done to defend. This attack mode, seems obviously way more powerful than, than what DRS has been in Formula One, and obviously, push to pass in the IndyCar series. Yeah, and it seems like, just another thing that, Formula E has, that can really, push the drivers forward and improve the on-track product. I know a lot of people, haven't really been a fan of the Peloton, Pat style racing that, we see these Formula E races, but it really seems like, that Formula E cares about its on-track product and is, just doing what it can, make it a compelling, thing for people to watch and follow.
For sure. Sorry, I had to unmute myself because I'm getting some traffic just outside my apartment here, some engines revving, but we should be all good here. Let's talk about one of the scarier moments during the race, a big crash involving Pepe Marti, who went airborne, rolled upside down, but thankfully was able to emerge okay. Antonio Felix da Costa and Nico Muller both slowed from the safety car, catching Marti off guard. Marti was handed a penalty for the next race for causing the crash. We also saw a penalty for Pascal Wehrlein for spinning his wheels on pit road. Dan Ticktum also received multiple penalties, including one for performing a burnout in the pit lane. So, Kobe, Formula E has been known for frequent penalties in the past. Is this something that you think the series needs to maybe dial back a little bit?
Well, what sanctioning body, is responsible for Formula E? The FIA, and it seems like all the FIA sanctioned championships, have an issue with frequent penalties and things that don't necessarily need to be a penalty. So I guess this is nothing new from the other FIA championships that we have. Formula One, they've issued quite a handful of questionable penalties as well. And the FIA World Endurance Championship, they've had their share. So it just seems to be an FIA thing, with all the frequent penalty. But sometimes in Formula E, it's gotten kind of crazy sometimes. I remember, and I think to their respect, it's gotten better in some cases. But obviously not perfect. I remember in the past, you watch a Formula E race, and then you think you saw the final result, and then by the time you come back the next day, the result of the Formula E race has changed about 2, 3, 4, or even 5 times. Just really crazy. How that happened. It seemed like almost after every single Formula E race, you probably expected to see a penalty, and just not, and that's probably not really a great way to go about things. But yeah, some interesting penalties that they call, throughout this weekend. I actually wasn't aware about, the penalty, against Dan Ticktum there, for performing a burnout in the pit lane. Not sure what Ticktum was doing there, but, unfortunate to see his race, and it was, not a good race for the Cupra Formula E team. Ticktum was expected to be one of the main contender, and then I believe he got hit by Eduardo Mortara at the start, ended up, damaging his car there, and retiring from the race. And then, obviously, his new teammate, I believe, which is Pepe Marti, had that scary airborne accident. Really happy that Pepe was able to walk away from that, scary crash in his Formula E debut. And certainly Ben's going to talk about some of the main highlights from this race, because there were, several highlights as well that happened throughout this, Formula E season opener. Looking forward to seeing, what's going to happen throughout the rest of this season. I believe the next race is next month in Mexico.
Yeah. Also, I'm very happy Pepe Marti is okay. I mean, it was, I think on the broadcast, I don't know if it was for you guys as well. I assume the broadcast was the same, but it was almost like the commentators were talking because of the caution that had come out, whatever it was. And then they cut to a red flag, and all of a sudden the the whole car was destroyed and there was a fire, which doesn't usually happen as much as people stereotypically think it does in Formula E. And I was like, holy hell, what happened? And then obviously you saw Pep just woo and up and over. So glad he's okay. But yeah, I think Kobe makes 100% sense when he says the penalties in Formula E, yes, it's an FIA thing. It's just one of those things where I think if Lando was racing a Formula E car today with that with the Yuki block, I think they probably would have penalized him, to be honest with you. I just think Formula E is super, super inconsistent with what they call, and then when there is a penalty too, it's almost like too strict. You could do a very minor thing and all of a sudden it's a 10-second penalty. It's like, what the heck? And I even question myself, like messaging you guys, because I'm obviously still learning. I was like, what? When did that penalty occur? And then why did that happen? And this is a sport too. I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but guys like Felix Acosta, like Vern, and then I think Sebastian Buemi, I think guys like Mitch Evans too have criticized them publicly, which usually the FIA doesn't appreciate that. But saying, yeah, they're too strict. We don't have the freedom to fight each other. It's just unclear what are the guidelines. So it's just one of those things where it's like there's just throwing penalties out there. It's like, oh, you didn't brake fast enough, 5-second penalty. Oh, you conserve it because you wrecked. Guess what? You have a grid penalty next race. And it's like, what the hell? So yeah, I think it's one of those things that they need to reevaluate. I think too with the shorter distances, they have less time to really evaluate it too, because if some incident occurs with only 2 or 1 lap to go in the E-Prix, and then all of a sudden you cross the line first, but now you get a penalty because it took the FIA too long to decide. Now you're finishing off the podium because you got 5 seconds for something you did with 2 laps to go. So yeah, I think it's inconsistent, but I think it's very frequent. A lot of penalties, so I guess less room for error. But I'd argue it's also easier to make errors because some of the tracks with the street circuits and stuff they go to, these cars are bulky, but there's not a lot of room. A lot of this is like 2-lane racing, and you saw a couple times. Was it Degrassi? Was that his name? Luca completely just took out. Was it Norman Nato? There was somebody, or maybe it was Mortada. I'm thinking of one of the red vehicles at this point. Completely took him out into the wall because he didn't really give any room, because there is no room to really give. So yeah, I think the penalty is a little too frequent in my opinion, but to each their own when it comes to that. Just now we got to wait another month. So it's fun. It's very interesting that the 2026 season starts in the 2025 season, but that's just the way Formula E likes to be.
All right, we'll leave it there. Following some final notables here, Oliver Rowland, like I mentioned, the defending series champion, in second place. Nick Cassidy continues his podium streak to 4 consecutive races, but fails to extend his winning streak to 4 consecutive races. Rookie Joel Eriksson finishes ahead of teammate Sebastian Buemi for Envision Racing's double points finish. Andretti and Porsche tied for the team standings lead, and Porsche also leads the manufacturer standings as well, ahead of Stellantis and Nissan. And as Kobe mentioned, the next race next month in Mexico City on January 10th. That's going to do it for our recaps here today on the wrap-up show, and our last wrap-up show of 2025. So, Matthew Bro, I will start with you. A shining moment from you, not just from this weekend, but for the entire 2025 year. What comes to mind? What stood out the most to you this season?
So much, honestly. I joke, I was going to say pick a winner. All of us did incredible this year. I mean, I think I ended with like 88, which is freaking insane. And then Kobe was in the 70s too. It's incredible what we were able to watch. And I think my one shining moment for the entire year, there was so much going on. I think Paulo, obviously, Marc Marquez, so many things you can go into. But I think the fact we made it through a year health-wise, I think most drivers were safe. I know there were a couple injuries, but I think looking back at that, seeing not many tragic things happening, I don't really think anything in the top series happening. I think that was probably my one shining moment, just to see the safety of these cars. And there were a lot of freak and horrible accidents, flips and stuff that the drivers came out unscathed. So I think that was one of them. But yeah, watching the grid ranking this year too, obviously Sebastian Ogier too, not doing a full season, so winning the title is pretty crazy. Marc Marquez, Alex Palou, guys like Denny Hamlin, Kyle Larson, Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, just so much fun racing to watch this year. So I would say overall that's my shining moment. It's just being able to watch this whole year, and then the safety, pretty much most drivers were uninjured for the whole year, and just a lot of new winners, stuff like that across all the major sports we cover here at Grid Network. So that's my one entire shining moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna do two. I'm gonna do one from the weekend and one for the whole year. My one shining moment from this weekend, was Nick Cassidy finishing on the podium. Continuing his streak going back to last season. When he left Jaguar. But the fact I'm giving my shining moment to Cassidy, it was the fact that he's with the new team Citroen. Which is brand new to Formula E, and for I know I believe they're replacing Maserati if I remember correctly. So I know they're basically like the same group of people there, but different brand. You don't really expect a new brand to come in the Formula E, and finish on podium on debut like that. So I'm sure Citroen has a lot to be really happy about. With Nick Cassidy leading the charge, and it'll be interesting to see if Cassidy and Citroen can continue to score podiums throughout the year. And potentially get some race wins. But if you want to drive to elite your program, Nick Cassidy is certainly the right one to do that. And my one shining moment from the entire year is a race that happened, a couple of months ago, which really seems crazy. It's been 2 months, I believe, since that happened, or not quite. But this year's Bathurst 1000, that was one of the greatest motor races I've ever seen in my entire life. And I don't say that stuff lightly. I don't like to say, this is the greatest race I've ever seen. Unless it was. And I really felt like, that it's up there on my Mount Rushmore of top 5 races of all time. It was it was the race that had me on the edge of my seat from start to finish, all 1,000 kilometers, all 6 hours or so, however long that race was. It was just absolutely incredible to see what those supercars drivers were able to do, in those, in the heavy rain, the mixed conditions. It was just, intense all around, and came down to the final lap. It was just, a remarkable, magical race, that I'll remember for the rest of my life. And it's right up there with the MAF TV 500 we saw in the IndyCar series, right up there, what I guess, say that the first race I ever saw in NASCAR, I'm probably biased, the 2007 Daytona 500 is right up there with those races, in my opinion, of one of the best races I've ever seen. It's just really rare to have a race that has absolutely everything and, isn't lacking one thing. And that was this year's Bathurst 1000. It was just such a good race. So it's probably a race, that we'll be talking about many years from now, and probably a race you'll go watch, on replay in the future, because it was that good of a race.
All right, before I go into mine, I do just want to take a quick moment here. I want to extend my thoughts, prayers, and condolences to the families of Michael Annette and Nick Joanitis, who we both lost this weekend. Far too young, both of them. I know Nick especially been going through some health issues the last couple of years, but I was able to follow his career in the ARCA Menard Series West for the last several seasons as he ran part-time, and was actually your last place finisher when I was out there with Brock Beard at NASCAR.info at Sonoma earlier this year. Really enjoyed getting to tell his story over the last few seasons, and such a shame to wake up to that news this weekend, as well as hearing about Michael Annette Friday night. I know Michael got a lot of criticism, was kind of one of the main pay drivers of the 2010s with his Pilot and Flying J connections, and people questioning whether he really deserved his ride that he had at Junior Motorsports, but was really able to turn it around later in his career. And of course, who can ever forget that dominant win in the Xfinity Series season opener in 2019. So just really sad news on both of those fronts. And yeah, my heart goes out to all of his family and his friends and his fans as well, who have been in for a rough 48 hours, understandably so. I just want to continue to send them all our best here from the Grid Network. In terms of ending the show on a bit of a better note with our shining moments here, the shining moment for today, I think, is obvious. You have to give a call to Lando Norris and really all 3 of our championship contenders, and I think this, by extension, is my shining moment for the entire year. I thought this was a great season. I thought, after the dominance that we've seen from Max Verstappen and Red Bull in this era since 2022, and especially 23 when he won 19 of 22 races, Checo picking up 2 wins, Red Bull coming so close to the perfect season, to see McLaren take the fight to Red Bull and ultimately come out on top with the Constructors last year and then dominating the Constructors this year, and Lando holding on for the Drivers' Championship. And I'm sure Oscar's going to come back very strong and very motivated next year to try to get a Drivers' Championship of his own. But I think it's easy to forget. Everybody remembers when Fernando Alonso was driving that car in the McLaren Honda in the mid-2010s, how dreadful they were, P9 in the Constructors' standings a couple of times. and kind of sending Fernando into a bit of a sabbatical after 2018. Obviously, now he's come back with Alpine and Aston Martin, but I still remember the season opener in 2023. I think Lando and Oscar finished, 16th and 17th? Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, they were completely off the pace, absolutely nowhere in sight. And then they were able to start making that progress and make those climbs up through the field. And I said for the last couple of years, if they can just start the season on the right note, and they almost didn't this year in Australia as well. You remember on the slick track, both of them went off course, and Lando was able to still recover and hang on. Oscar, unfortunately, had to settle for, I think, 9th place, just a couple of points in the back of the grid. But they came out flying right at the start of a year and were able to hold that even through the troubles of the second half of the season and made for a very compelling championship battle. Even if Max hadn't had that tremendous comeback, it was still very close between Lando and Oscar all season. And I think that's something that we've been lacking in Formula One the last couple of years. And that is why full season championships mean more when it comes down to a natural battle like this. You don't always get it every year, and that makes the years that you do get it that much more special. So for Lando today and for the entire 2025 Formula One season, those are my one shining moments as we close out the final wrap-up show of 2025. So looking ahead here at the Grid Network later today, the final grid ranking of 2025 will be updated on Grid Network TV's social media platforms. Wednesday, Kobe, you will be back on the air with Matt White and Tanner Smith. I guess is Tanner filling in for Josh? Do we have that?
Yes, we'll have Tanner on, and he'll be providing another update from the courtroom in Charlotte.
That's great. All right, so we can look forward to that and all the rest of the latest motorsports news from around the world as well. And then I'll be back with Joe Samniego and hopefully a couple of others for the final Women in Motorsports program recap of 2025. That'll be published sometime next weekend. Then another Grid Tonight next weekend after that, then a break for the holidays, and then we will see you all in 2026. Please continue to support the Grid Network on Patreon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Even though I won't be hosting the Encore show next year, you will still certainly see me pop in as a fill-in host and analyst from time to time. So we'll look forward to that as well. For Kobe Lambeth from Grid Tonight and Matthew Bro from GridNetworkTV.com, I'm Ben Schneider from LastCar.info. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time right here on the Grid Network. Before we do that, it's been a little while since I've been the host here. Got a couple of comments from Joe I want to mention here quick before we sign off. Bathurst 1000 was epic. Best race of 2025. Lando Norris, Oliver Rowland, Chaz Mostert winning their first championship, and 100% agreement with me as well. Thank you for that, Joe. Thank you for tuning in. We certainly wish you well as you continue to recover. All right. Now, for Kobe Lambeth and Matthew Bro, I'm Ben Schneider. We will see you next time on the Grid Network. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everybody.